Hello, everybody, and again, thanks for having me today. I'm grateful for this opportunity to again provide some insights on reserves and answer some key questions. So, yeah, the title of this is Fundamentals of Reserves, Purpose, Process, and Planning for Success. So, I do have quite a bit of slides here, and I want to start my timer, make sure we don't go over. But I will do my best to stay within those time boundaries and make sure we have time at the end to answer your questions. I think that you can submit those questions in the chat. And then once we finish the presentation, Megan can go through those questions and then present those to me after. And if for some reason we don't get to all of the questions, Megan can send those to me and I can answer them in an email and we can potentially distribute those to people who are interested. All right. So let's get started here. Well, who am I? Well, my name is Elon Goldman. I'm a reserve specialist. I am president of our Association Reserves Texas office, as Megan had stated. And I started with Association Reserves back in 2015, working primarily out of California, and then opened our Texas regional office in 2018. So we primarily do work in Texas and surrounding states, including Oklahoma and Arkansas. And we do approximately we several hundred reserve studies a year here. And I am an RS number 358. And what the reserve specialist credential is, it's a credential that's offered through CAI, Community Associations Institute. Hopefully, you are aware of CAI. They're a great organization that works with community associations, and the RS credential really just means that the individual has experience preparing reserve studies and has demonstrated the ability to do so. Association reserves, kind of looking as a whole, we were established in 1986, and since then have completed over 80,000 reserve studies. So a lot of reserve studies over those years, and now we have 17 regional offices throughout the United States, and we're staffed with 34 credentialed reserve specialists. So you may be asking, are these numbers great? 34, it's we have some of the largest number of reserve specialists out of any company in the country, and it's great for us to collaborate with so many different people. And as Megan mentioned, yes, we work with community associations, and that's all we really do. All we don't prepare. Transition studies. We don't do appraisals. All we do as a company is reserve studies, working with different types of community associations that include, townhomes, high rises, single family home developments, schools, worship facilities, timeshares, and a lot more. Um, so let's get to the information today, kind of the outlook of what we're going to be covering. So we're going to be answering the main question, what are reserves? We're going to go through a little bit of reserve study basics and then talk about planning for success. And I put here planning for success because there's different types of funding that we can provide to associations, the type of guidance we're giving associations. But want you to really be able to take the information we are providing in this report and using it um, to really guide your association to a more successful and sustainable financial future, right? And so some of this might be a review for some of you here, but I think it's pretty imperative that we cover these basics and answer these questions. Again, going into budget season, progressing throughout the year, so you can be thinking of these things. If you have a reserve study, if you're thinking about getting a reserve study, and again, hopefully we answer a lot of your questions today. All right, so we're going to answer the question, well, what are reserves? So, practical definition is money that an association sets aside over long periods of time for large repair and replacement projects. Okay, that's a great example, but this money is really specific in nature. Reserves are meant to be spent on specific projects, and the reserves accumulate over time. A common misconception with some of our clients and people I've worked with in the past think that reserves are some sort of savings account, and it's not. I really like to talk about reserves as a spending account. We're, again, looking at projects over long periods of time and funding those projects so the money is there to pay for these things when the projects fail or they reach the end of their life. Okay, and we're going to get more into reserves and funding later on in this webinar. A question I like to start off with is what reserves are for. Are they for the future or are they for the here and now? So I want you to take a couple seconds and think in your mind, what are reserves for? Okay. If you're thinking the future, that's incorrect. And the reason why is reserves are for the here and now because reserves are offsetting ongoing deterioration, right, of your common elements. We're going to get into what those common elements are and how we select those, but I want you to just start thinking that reserves are not for spending money 10 years from now or 20 years from now, even though we might be funding for these long-term projects over time. The contributions and reserves are for the here and now that are, again, offsetting ongoing deterioration. You're going to hear me say ongoing deterioration or offsetting deterioration many, many times throughout this webinar because that's exactly what we're looking at. That is the really the challenge, the cost that we're facing, right? And so, again, the contributions to the reserve fund are offsetting that ongoing deterioration. Again, hit it again. So we're going to look at the base, the fundamental aspect of an association. We talk about the budget, right? Your budget really is split up into two buckets. You have, and we'll start out with the operating funds. So operating funds, if you can compare it to something, you can consider it like your personal checking account, right? It's for routine costs, things that are happening on a daily, weekly, monthly timeline. These projects can typically include your utility bill, filling up the gas tank, going to the grocery store. They're more for routine maintenance, and typically operating funds are expected to be spent in the year that money's collected, right? It's not money that's accruing over time. Okay. And if you have designed a pretty solid budget at your association, at your board, on your board, then again, that money should be spent in the year that it's collected. Now, the second thing we need to look at is reserve funds. Well, what are these reserve funds? Well, they're for more infrequent cost. They're for these, again, long-term projects. They're restricted in nature for these specific projects, not to be used on those operating expenses. And these reserve funds accumulate over time. They're not spent on that daily, weekly, monthly basis. Typically, reserves are spent annually, a year or more. And they're for specific projects like roofing, painting pavement, HVAC, elevators. We're going to get into those projects and how we select them in a little bit. So again, really just thinking about two different buckets here, your ongoing operating expenses and the more long-term reserve funds and reserve expenses, okay? So we're going to get into reserve study basics. Well, what is a reserve study? And we look to reserve study standards, which has been around since the late 90s, over 25 years now. And what the basic definition, a budget planning tool identifying the current status of the reserve fund that provides a stable and equitable funding plan over time, offsetting future major common area expenditures. Okay. Well, that's a great explanation, but putting it simply, there's several outputs of a reserve study, and it really answers the question of what are we funding for? Do we have enough in terms of money? And kind of where do we go from here? What things are we funding for? What's our strength of this reserve fund based on a metric called percent funded that we're going to talk about? And how do we offset that ongoing deterioration? Deterioration. As I mentioned before, it's what every single reserve study that we produce is looking at in terms of these components and what we have to offset moving forward. Okay, so we're going to get into the types of reserve studies. There's three different types, starting with level one, what's called a full reserve study. This is a reserve study that's starting from scratch. We've never been to the property before. It's where we, establishing this component list for the first time. And typically, it's the most time-intensive type of reserve study that we do. We're really, coming on site and determining what needs to appear in this component list, and we're gonna get to that in a little bit. So we have level one is the full reserve study. Level two, there's two types of updates, and the first one is a level two or an update with site visit. And this type of reserve study is where we're reevaluating a current list of components. So we're looking at that past full reserve study and determining on site what's changed since that last update, um, what we need to adjust, have the conditions of these elements changed, and you're really getting again, a brand new reserve study. We're just reevaluating a pre-existing list of components. So the level two reserve studies are a little bit less time intensive because we don't have to do all this, measuring and quantifying unless things have changed. I mean, I like to make this point because in Texas, there's a lot of associations that are under development. They're going to be 5,000 units, and there's currently 1,000 units. We come in and do a full reserve study, come in the next year, do a level two update, but they added a new amenity center. And it's something that we can add in that update. We would still consider a with site visit, might be priced a little bit differently, but we would incorporate those new elements, those new amenities into the new reserve study. So again, reevaluating, but also adding things that might have not been there in the first place. And then we have the level three, which is an update, no site visit reserve study. And this reserve study doesn't involve a site inspection. It involves reevaluating that list of components, and it's done typically more frequently. And if we look at that level two, or just industry best practice as a whole for reserve study site inspections are best done or recommended to be completed at least every 3 years. Okay. So that level full is really only needs to happen once unless you have that developing community. And then this with site visits, typically every 3 years, and then you can update in between. So those are the three. And the reserve study is broken out into two parts. We call that the physical analysis and the financial analysis. So the physical analysis is the first part of the reserve study where we're going to come on to the property, come on site. Typically, it starts with a meeting, kind of meeting of the minds with either the board of directors, maybe the management. If it's a high rise, the building engineer and the board of directors. We really like to discuss, historical information about the association. What has the board done over the past few years? Get a sense of how the board operates? What are the plan projects moving forward? And these questions are also answered with, information forms that we send out. But I like to, and our staff, we like to show up to inspections to really paint a good mental picture of this property before we've been there, or before we start the inspection, because we've really never been there. So we do have to ask a lot of questions and get access to the property. But throughout the inspection, we're, photographing elements, we're quantifying things, we're, counting. We might even be taking, note annotating serial numbers and model numbers for specific mechanical equipment and evaluating the condition of these things. So it takes a lot of time. Typically, the average site inspection lasts a day, but for larger properties, it could be a multi-day inspection, and it really depends on the number of team members we have working on that site. Um, the second part is the financial analysis. This is where we take all of that data that we accumulated on site, measured, quantified, photographed, and then we go back to the office and start to put together this reserve study. I like to refer to it as like putting together a puzzle, and especially because every property is different, we're determining what the condition of certain projects were in, and what state they were in, comparing that with um, components that associations in the area, cost ranges, and really it allows us to draw up conclusions. Once we have this established list of components, understand how the association has operated historically, we're able to make financial conclusions, and then which we'll talk about a little bit later. So there's three outcomes of the reserve study, starting with the component list, and then we're going to get into reserve fund strength, otherwise known as percent funded, and then talk about the funding plan. So, the component list, we're going to have a complete detail of life and cost estimates. Every component, and a component, when keep saying component, it's really just a project. It's an instance where the association is going to be spending some money at some point in time. Okay. And each one of these components has a useful life, a remaining useful life, and a cost. So, a frequency, how old the project is and what it's going to cost in today's dollar to replace. And the criteria for selecting components should remain consistent across the board. Um, and these components or selecting components is defined in reserve study standards. So what components do we include? Well, to answer that question, we look at reserve study standards, and reserve study standards has recently been updated. There was a four-part test, and now it's a three-part test. And the first question we answer, or the kind of the first box we check, is the project needs to be the association's obligation. And so to answer that question, we look to the association's governing documents to determine, well, what does the association maintain? And second is the project needs to be reasonably anticipated in terms of scope and schedule, and it needs to be a significant cost to the association. So typically, when we have these discussions with the board of directors or management, we'll ask, well, how has the association operated in the past with a $3,000 expense? But typically, if an association doesn't know, um, the average cost for a reserve project is anywhere from a half to 1% of the total operating budget, right? So, and that can vary from property to property, but we kind of go into the inspection with this three-part test in mind and really um, visually filter out anything that doesn't kind of apply to this three-part test. Okay. And so it filters out indeterminate projects, life of building projects, projects of insignificant cost and capital improvements. So indeterminate projects, things that we can't anticipate put a life on, life of building projects, structural elements, electrical parts of the building, foundational aspects of buildings, things that aren't really predictable. Of course, if the association has had a history of foundation replacements, that's something we can build into the reserve study. But going in with kind of a blank slate, we use this three-part test to filter out projects. And what it means is that the average association that we're working with typically has 25 to 50 reserve projects. And of course, this is going to vary by property type. A 5,000 unit single family home development with three amenity centers is going to have a lot more components than a 20 unit townhome building. But on average, it's 20 to 50 components. And some of those projects that we fund for are roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, um, major mechanical equipment like cooling towers, chillers, boilers for high rises, amenity area upgrades, renovating the clubhouse, doing lake and pond maintenance, and in the northern Texas area, erosion control is a big project, even landscaping. So there's a lot of things that we're funding for, and again, applying that three-part test as we're walking through their property, aggregating this list of things that we will be funding for in the reserve study. Um, Big question we get all the time, capital improvement. So let's look at this new dock on this lake in the bottom left picture here. We need to ask the question, well, if it can be funded through reserves, does it currently exist? And well, if it's a new dock and it doesn't currently exist, the answer is no. And the reason being is that this project, say it's a $100,000 project to build this new dock that never existed before, it means that this project was never funded or considered in prior year reserve budgets, meaning that you should not spend reserve dollars on it. The project has to exist. Now, again, the same thing can go along similar lines if the board of directors hears from the ownership that, hey, we want to build a new park, which might, increase property values or increase other people's interest in living in the community. Since it never currently existed, it should not be funded or reserve dollars should not be paid for or spent on that project, excuse me. Now, If it's a natural upgrade, a technological upgrade, or just an improvement to that specific pre-existing component, then that's okay. Reserve money can be spent on that. And an example there would be if you had a pretty simple like intercom system that has maybe it's just a keypad and no screen or anything like that. Maybe cost $1,000 to $2,000 to replace, and you re want to replace it. The board wants to replace it with a intercom system that has a big screen and a camera that's $10,000. We would consider that a natural upgrade, and even though it's more expensive, reserved money can be spent on that project. So, uh, capital improvements, it's a big one. If they do occur, they should be paid for by some other means, whether that's a capital account that the board was preparing, you're kind of funding over time, um, again, or some other type of, even operating. If some associations have a surplus in operating and they have many, different money markets, and so I've seen in the past associations use operating funds if they're in a really good position reserve wise. So that's just a key thing I want you to grasp: the capital improvement versus a natural upgrade of these components. And as you're going through your component list, you might ask the question, well, I don't see this specific element. What about this missing bridge? And so when something catches your eye that you think might not appear in the reserve city, kind of want you to ask yourself some questions. So first, refer to the three-part test. Does this specific project pass all three parts of the three-part test? And so if it's a walking bridge, maybe it's a 10 by 5 wood walking bridge that falls below a minimum threshold cost for this property. Maybe they have $1 million operating budget and a 10,000 or $5,000 expense to replace this bridge is lower than their threshold. So that might be the reason why. Or maybe you need to look further and urge it or consider looking further in the report. We have a component details section at the bottom of our reports. That's not just a tabled list. It has kind of details within the details. It provides more information on what we're seeing and what's there. Where this bridge might be combined with four other bridges. Maybe they were all replaced at the same time. So it might be, again, somewhere else in the report. And now, if we really did truly miss this, and if it happens, we're human. There's things that are missed, and that's why it's important to update the reserve study regularly, at least every 3 years to have an on-site visit. But don't let that stop you from spending the money on that project. If it's a true reserve project, true common area maintenance responsibility, spend the money and then add that in the next update. Okay. Again, going back to what if it costs more, that kind of just want to point this out. If we were under or over budgeting for a specific project, if we are, budgeting $15,000 for that bridge replacement, it costs $10,000. It's not a problem because the money will be reallocated among the rest of the components. We're using a cash flow method of funding, a pooled method for all these components. So it's not a big issue and it will be distributed amongst the rest. And again, if we're under budgeting for that project, again, spend reserves and update that cost in your reserve study moving forward. Okay. Speaking of components, like to get you thinking about component significance. So typically about 60 to 80% of reserve contribution support. How many components are less? So think about this for a second. Want to ask this of you. How many components do you think 60 to 80% of reserve contribution support? And the answer is 5 or less. Okay. And what that means is that typically 5 or less components are really driving this reserve funding over time. We're going to get to fully funded balance, but they're really creating this deterioration that you have to keep up with over time. And those 5 components really depend on your construction style. If you're a high-rise building on the coast, those 5 components will probably include waterproofing elements, decks, balconies, um, caulking and sealing joints of the building, roofing. Whereas if you're a single family home development who's gated, your big components might be asphalt and maybe sidewalks and trails. In Texas, we have a lot of trails. So you might be, having a lot of expenses there. And another example, if you're a townhouse or condo, you're going to have, roofing, siding, painting, those types of things. So these five or less major projects will vary depending on your construction style. And when you're thinking about components, we don't want you thinking about the largest cost, kind of zooming in on these projects in your reserve study and and looking at the largest cost. We want you to think in terms of cost per year. Okay. So if we look at two costs here, $100,000 is obviously larger than $50,000. Okay. So the $100,000 could be a roofing replacement, and then the $50,000 project could be painting of wood siding. Okay. But if we look at the reserve study, this $100,000 roofing project that happens every 20 years costs $5,000 per year. Now we're not including inflation with this. Let's take that out of the picture. So if you divide 100,000 by 20, it's $5,000 per year. Now, if you look at this $50,000 expense that happens every 5 years, if we're painting wood siding, that's $10,000 per year. So that $10,000 per year is twice as significant as that $100,000 roofing project. So that's, again, when we're thinking about these dominant components, also think about the cost per year. Okay, so we talked about components and how we select them. Now we're going to talk about the second outcome of reserve study, which is the evaluation of reserve fund strength, and that is called percent funded. So percent funded will fluctuate over time. We have a barometer here, and we have different levels of percent funded going from 0 to 30%, which is in a high risk range of special assessment, a 30 to 70% where, association would be a more moderate risk, and 70 to 100%, which is a position of strong reserves. And so if you think of um, percent funded as, or sorry, if you think of your credit score is a measure of your personal risk to lenders or banks. So if you look at the reserve study as a credit report and then kind of refine it down to percent funded can be looked at as the association's risk of special assessments, loans, or deferred maintenance moving forward. So kind of it's one of the best indicators at looking at an association's health at one period in time. Okay. And so to answer the question of how is percent funded calculated, the second outcome of the reserve study, it's a pretty simple equation, and we look at how much money do you have, and we divide that by how much money you should have, and that's where you get percent funded. And to answer the question, well, how much money do you have? That's pretty simple. We look at what your projected reserve balance is as of the start of the upcoming fiscal year. Typically, we are preparing these reports ahead of your fiscal year. So we might talk with your, accountant or your management company to determine if we're working ahead of the fiscal year. Well, how much do you have in reserves now? How much is going to be contributed to the reserve fund during the rest of the year? And are you going to have any reserve expenses to kind of arrive at that number? How much you have, okay? And to the answer, how much you should have, that is called the fully funded balance. Fully funded balance is defined in reserve study standards. This is a equation, and the equation is we take the current age of the project, divide that by the expected useful life, and multiply that by the replacement cost. So we take how old is the component, how often or what's the frequency of that project, and multiply it by the replacement cost, the current replacement cost. And that's summed up over all the components, okay? And so this equation is applied to every single component. Again, if 25 to 50 is average, to every single one of those projects in the reserve study. And we're going to show you a couple examples here. So here's an example of pool furniture. And the pool furniture's useful life is 5 years, the remaining useful life is 0, and the current cost is $4,600. How much do you think you should have in reserves based on this project? Oops. Oops, sorry. The answer is $4,600. So since this project has 0 life left, that means that you should have the total sum of that project in reserves, which is $4,600. If we look at this pool project, it could be a pool resurface project. Its useful life is 10, its remaining useful life is 5. The cost is $10,000. So it's 5 years old. It's half of its life. How much do you think you should have in reserves at this point in time? That answer is $5,000. And that answer is $5,000 because again, the useful life, the expected life of this pool surface project is halfway used up, meaning you should have $5,000. And with this example, like previous examples, we're not taking inflation into consideration. We're kind of leaving that out to simplify this. Okay. So if we look at this pool project over its life, its 10-year life, we can see that every single year, so this is year 5, the association should have $5,000. In year 6, $6,000. Year 7, $7,000. And in year 10, when that project has 0 life left, the association should have $10,000 to execute that project. And once that project is completed, that life resets. So this is the ebb and flow of these projects, funding them over their life and then spending that money and those projects resetting. It's happening with all of these reserve projects, and we're um, putting this all together to determine what that fully funded balance is, what your reserve fund strength is, and where do you go from here? Okay. So if you look, we look at this component list, say this is all of the components that this one association has, and we see this pool furniture project. We know that there's no life left. The pool furniture probably needed to be replaced last year, and we know that we need this $4,600. That's the fully funded balance for that one specific project. We go to the pool resurfacing project. As we looked at in the prior example, it's halfway used up. We should have half of that money in reserves. Okay. Now we apply that same math again to all of these reserve components in the study. The total for all of these components is $154,100. So if this association had $154,100 in reserves, say at the start of their next fiscal year, we would consider that the value of deterioration is in balance with the fully funded balance, meaning that the association would be 100% funded. Now, that's an ideal balance. Any reserve study that we put together, funding plan that we put together, which we're going to talk about in the next section, is going to have this goal in mind. Okay. Now, if the association had less money, let's say they had $107,870 at the start of their next fiscal year projected there, then we divide that by the fully funded balance, and they would be 70% funded, which is a pretty good position, but we're probably going to put together a funding plan that's going to get them to 100% over time. So if the association is 70% funded, we're going to say they have low risk of special assessments and loans and deferred maintenance. This is a pretty good position to be in. And if we look at special assessment risk, it's measured on a 0 to 100 scale. You can even argue that it goes to 120%. And if we look at the percentages here, as you near 0, the higher your special assessment risk gets. When we're putting together funding plans, of course, over time, we're going to want to bring you towards that 70 to 100% funded mark. But if we look at the 0 to 10% mark, we can see that associations, it's not a 100% chance of special assessment, it's a 60% chance. And there's a 40% chance of not having a special assessment. So it's still a 50-50, but it's still a significant risk. And that's not where we want our clients to be. But again, going back to this metric that's produced in the reserve study, it's a great indication of, well, you know, what, what have prior boards done? Or sorry, it's the result of what prior boards have done in prior years, potentially underfunding reserves or adequately funding reserves and showing kind of where they're at one point in time. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this is that the lower the percent funded you are, the higher uh, chance that you're going to incur special assessments, that you're not going to be able to pay for that upcoming roof replacement, that you might have loans in the future. And it's a position that you don't want to be in as a board member or be in as a community. It creates a lot of problems. It creates, a lot of disruption. And percent funded, again, reveals that risk of special assessment deferred maintenance and higher cost of the association. And also home values. If an association is below 30% funded, it's highly likely that they've been underfunding reserves and they're not going to be able to maintain the property um, to the best how it should be maintained. They might not have the money to, repaint the wood every 5 years, and instead they do it every 8, which causes more deterioration and higher costs for replacement in the future. And it does increase board liability if things are not maintained and things fail earlier than expected, when these cash flow deficiencies do occur. Okay. And the third outcome of a reserve study is the funding plan. So we've talked about the components. We've talked about percent funded, how that shows the current financial position of the association and the risks of special assessment. Now we're going to talk about the funding plan. Um, and what we're going to do is review the current contribution rate. What if the association kept doing what they're doing now? Is it going to be enough to pay for these projects in the near term and long term? And an important part of the funding plan is that it should match the frequency of regular assessments. If your assessments happen on a monthly basis, then your reserve contribution should happen on a monthly basis. If it's quarterly, it's quarterly. You should not, some of our clients, or I've heard, with recent discussions with board members, they kind of, in recent years, they have not contributed to reserves and waited towards the end of the year to see if there was a surplus in the operating fund, and then took that would take any surplus and put it in reserves. That's not a responsible way to fund reserves. You should be funding, again, ongoing and matching the frequency of your regular assessments. And when it comes to the funding plan, we might recommend a special assessment. And the special assessment might be because there's a big project coming up and the association is just underfunded, but it's really the result of prior years of underfunding reserves. And sometimes it's needed for to be a catch-up assessment, right? Um, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So funding principles, when we look at putting together um, a funding plan, is the funding plan needs to be stable and equitable over time. It needs to be fair to all the owners. The funding plan, there shouldn't be any huge swings where it goes up and then down in one year. It should be nice and stable with inflationary increases over time. One of the most important parts is that the funding plan should be sufficient in cash. It should never drop below zero. It should never run out of money. So that's the worst thing that you can do, and it doesn't adhere to reserve study standards. So there are different funding goals. That would be a different conversation. But we would establish this funding rate again to offset ongoing deterioration, so the reserve balance never drops below zero. It needs to be distributed amongst all the components throughout their entire life cycle, um, where you're funding these projects every single year and you're not taking a year off. This is again fair to all the owners, and the funding plan needs to be fiscally responsible in terms of inflationary assumptions, in terms of interest assumptions, um, and you need to put together this plan and not think that future owners are going to be paying for deterioration that's happening right now. It needs to be paid along the way, along the entire of these uh, life cycle of these projects. So when we're looking at the funding plan, we want to look at the total cost of deterioration. We want to look at that in terms of cost per year. So to determine the rate of deterioration on a cost per year basis, taking out inflation, if we look at this pool resurface project, if the cost is $10,000 and its useful life is 10 years, that's $1,000 per year going back to that example. Okay. And if we look at this second project, say it's an asphalt seal coat, and that's also it's $5,000 every 5 years, and that's also $1,000 per year. That's how we would calculate that. And so that is the rate of deterioration. And what we like to show here is this pace line. So this is an Olympic swim race, and that that line is the pace line that the swimmers are trying to keep up with, and um, we would consider that to be the fully funded balance. So the swimmers are, you can say, are reserves, and that line is the fully funded balance or the deterioration rate moving forward. And we're trying to keep pace with that line, okay, by offsetting that ongoing deterioration um, based on this cost per year basis. So if we totaled up that rate of deterioration for these specific components, it's $20,170 per year. That's the pace line. So what that means is if we look at this chart of reserve fund strength, you see this green area is where associations will experience less risk of cash flow issues and deferred maintenance. That's where you want to be, okay? Now, if we put together a reserve funding plan that simply just offsets the deterioration, really no more, no less over the year, it kind of increases and decreases over time. The association maybe starts around 50% funded and will wind up there. This is still a position where an association might experience a moderate risk of those cash flow deficiencies and special assessments. But when we're putting together a funding plan, when we talk about planning for success, we probably want to provide a little bit of cushion and increase, kind of step on the gas a little more and increase those reserve contributions a little bit more than that annual deterioration rate, which is $20,170 per year. So this is something that we would again, want to shoot for in our reserve studies. Whereas if the association is contributing less than that annual rate of deterioration, likely the association is going to run out of money over time. Especially if they're not doing those inflationary increases. Maybe the board of directors just decided to keep reserve contributions the same for 5 years, or simply just did not contribute to reserves, and it's going to create a lot of problems in the future. It's going to create problems in terms of not being able to complete those reserve projects. It's going to lead to special assessments. It's going to lead to like problems within the community. It's not where you want to be. So those are kind of a few different plans that we can put together with different funding goals in mind. Now, this is full funding illustrated in terms of percent funded over a 30-year basis. You can see that the green recommended line um, increases equitably over time, where there are inflationary increases that get this particular association from this 35-ish% funded range to 100%. And why I like to show these graphs is that this is not a overnight solution. An association is not going to go from 35% funded to 100% funded tomorrow, right? Or next year. This is a long-term funding plan that needs to be followed and reevaluated over time. It's really important that these numbers are assessed on an annual basis to ensure that you're staying on track, right? And some associations that do not update their reserve study regularly or do not follow our contribution rates, uh, or bury their head in the sand, they will drop off, pretty quickly. Say they're, on track for a few years. They're going to put themselves in reverse, and it's going to create problems. So, it's again, think long term, think fully funding your reserves, and we would consider you to be fully funding reserves if you're following our full funding contribution rates. You're not fully funded, but you are following a full funding plan, or an alternate sort of plan that we're putting together. Okay. So what does underfunding look like? Here's an example of an association that just couldn't paint their, exterior stucco. You can see like a mold or mildew, a staining. If you drove up to this association, in your mind, you'd probably think that, wow, this place does not have any money. This is what happens if associations do not fund reserves adequately. Another example, we have deteriorated asphalt here, concrete swale that runs through the middle, alligator cracking, water ponding. This stuff does not happen overnight. You can see deterioration of asphalt happening years before this. This takes years and years and years. So this association is like actively trying to just, let this element, this asset fail. Whereas if this association had a reserve study and was following that plan, they would probably have, asphalt seal coating every 5 years and crack sealing. And then we would fund for maybe a mill and overlay or a complete resurfacing of this project. And this This association, again, probably had to do this several years in the past, but there's no money to do so. Um, Here's a wood mansard shingle roof that clearly needed to be replaced several years ago as well, and is probably the result of underfunding over the years. And all these things, decrease property values over time. So let's look at this roof. You might have owners that say, well, let's skip the reserve funding. Let's just special assess for this roof. Okay, well, let's look at these three examples. Well, we always say budgeted reserve contributions are the least expensive funding strategy, and that's because of interest over time. And this example is only looking at 1% of interest over the life of the roof. Okay. And nowadays, associations are getting better interest rates, so we can probably adjust these numbers. But for the sake of this example, this $250,000 roof over 15 years at 1% interest that's accrued is going to cost the association roughly $231,823. Whereas the special assessment, that's a $250,000 roof, that's about an $18,000 difference there. And the loan with, let's say, 7% interest over 7 years doesn't cost $320,000. Okay. So if we look at the difference in cost between the loan and just budgeted fair reserve contributions that are allocated to reserves over this component's lifetime, that's an $88,000 difference. Okay. Now, loans are good for like emergency situations, but they're always going to cost more in the long run. Special assessments too. There's a lot of hidden costs with special assessments. Likely, if it's a roof and the association has put off replacing that roof over many, many years, there's going to be water intrusion. There might be rotted decking. There's going to be deterioration there. And when, the roofer rips off the shingles, there might be another $50,000 more of repairs that need to be made, on the decking. So special assessments always cost more money, or not always, but there's a high likelihood they cost more money because they hide, there's just a lot of deterioration that's happened. So um, and special assessments are disruptive to the communities. They're unfair to owners, and they're really completely avoidable. If an association has a reserve study, is updating this reserve study regularly, then they can see these things coming. And, they're hard to pass, and it's going to build distrust with the community and the board of directors. And again, it lowers property values. So I'm going to get going for the sake of time here. Um, Loans, again, they're more expensive. Sometimes they're hard to qualify for. Lenders want to see a minimum amount of reserve funding, and if you have weak reserves, it's going to be harder for you to obtain a loan. And there's complicated sales and transactions, and it complicates sales and transactions and closings of units at the property. So, again, special assessments and loans are just uh, they're there for and available for important reasons, but we would rather have an association offset ongoing deterioration throughout the life of a component so that they can replace that project or execute that project on time. Okay. And how do we prepare for these expenses? By making adequate reserve contributions, revisiting or updating the reserve study regularly, on-site visit again every 3 years, and maybe updating in between, doing no site visits in between those site visit years, and listening to your trusted advisors. We see hundreds and hundreds of properties per year. We understand the costs in these regions. We understand the life expectancy of these projects. And so it's really wise for you to, again, listen to your advisors and figure out a plan that's going to work for your association to reduce your risks moving forward. Um, don't ignore deterioration. You want to live, I think everyone wants to live in a place where, the community is financially stable and it creates happy owners. The clients that we've worked with who have a history of special assessments are, I feel like they can't sleep at night. Whereas associations who have cash, who have enough money to maintain their common areas, they're proud of living in that association. They're generally more happy, and it really does show in terms of property values too. So I don't know if we'll get through all of these, but some common objections that we get, one of the biggest ones that I would point out is that, we can't afford this increase. Our our owners are living on fixed incomes, and that's important. And but we you can't ignore again this deterioration that's happening every day. And owning real estate's expensive. It's just replacing roofs. Um, as we say, Mother Nature and Father Time are unbeaten. These things deteriorate and they're expensive, and you have to offset that going forward. Reserve studies are too conservative. Generally, history has shown the opposite. Construction costs, PPI, often outpace inflation, and that's why it's important to update assumptions moving forward. If we're assuming that the inflation rate's 3%, and you last updated your reserve study in 2018, and it's 2024, well, a lot has changed, and inflation has exceeded that 3% over the past several years. So a lot of the numbers in your reserve study are going to be wrong. So the fact and the argument that the reserve studies are too conservative is often not the case. Um, and funding reserves based on a full funding goal, uh, is a good thing for associations. So, looking at just best practices overall, again, funding reserves through your regular reserve contributions, being proactive in terms of projects, not waiting till things fail, having your, evaluations through trusted vendors completed on a regular basis. If you have, a company that's looking at your plumbing or electrical, and they find issues, we can always bring those types of projects into the reserve study, even if they're one-time projects. So just make sure that you are on top of planning for these projects and getting bids and updating your reserve study regularly. And kind of everything's going to work out in the future if you follow the reserve study plan. Um, that's really all I had for today. We do have a ton of resources on our website, reservestudy.com. We have webinars that we host. We have ebooks and articles. We even have a book that we called Understanding Reserves that we sell. And yeah, if you would like to get in touch or request a proposal, you can do so there. And guess, yeah, that's it. Just open it up to questions at this time.
We do have some questions. The first one is, what does a reserve study cost and how long does the process take?
Good question. So yeah, the reserve study cost, it varies from property to property. Of course, it's really based on time, how long we're going to take with that physical analysis and then the, financial analysis bundled up. But you can say that I would say the average reserve study is about $3,000. Yeah, but the best way to understand and obtain the cost is to request a proposal. Timeline, we have different fee or sorry, different timelines. Our standard economy turnaround is about 12 weeks, but we do offer expedited turnarounds. But you can expect once your site visit's done to have a report in hand about 4 to 6 weeks. So once we kind of get things rolling and complete that inspection, about a month or two after, you'll have a report.
Okay, and the next one is, how much money should we be contributing to reserves?
Good question. And we can't answer that question or no until we really determine what that rate of deterioration is. And but I can say that the average association contributes about 15 to 40% of their total assessments to reserves. Okay. So the average being about 25. So if you have $1 million budget, you can expect your reserve contributions to be anywhere between 150,000 to $400,000. But the best thing to do would be to hire a reserve specialist or a professional reserve analyst, some credentialed professional, and to determine, yeah, what your funding, your contributions need to be.
Excellent. Our next question, when should a newly constructed community have a reserve study done?
Yeah, so answer that really as soon as possible. Some developers get reserve studies done as long as there's assets built, these common area maintenance responsibilities, as long as there's something there, uh, the association needs to start funding these things right away. So within the first year, would be good. And then, as I mentioned in the webinar, that if the community is being constructed over time, if new amenity centers, new parks, new assets are going to be added, then we can do those updates every 2 years, every 3 years, and add those new projects, those new elements to the reserve study.
Okay, and our next question, how long can you wait to transfer funds from a reserve account if an expense was paid from an operational account?
Oh, so how long, can you repeat that?
How long can you wait to transfer funds from a reserve account if an expense was paid from an
I see. So
operational
if
account?
I see, the question is if you're repaying the operating account, it was a true reserve expense, or maybe there was enough reserves there, the money was spent out of operating. It should be done within the same year. Yeah, it should not be carried over to the following year. If you are truly repaying, um, yeah, the fund, it should be done within the same year.
Okay. And are there any laws in Texas that make it mandatory for community associations to perform reserve studies?
No, there is no current law. There's yeah, no statutory requirements for reserve study updates or reserve studies in Texas at this time. I know the prospective buyers have the right to see reserve budgets and but no specific laws in Texas. Other states to expand on that, California and Washington State and now Florida have specific reserve study legislation, even Maryland and New Jersey. So there's a lot of states that do, and it seems like, there might be a wave that's kind of crossing the country, but yeah, nothing in Texas at this time. But it's not to
Okay.
say that you should not do a reserve study. I always explain it to prospective clients to say it's it's like planning for retirement, right? Having reserve study like planning for retirement. If you want to retire, you need to have some sort of plan, some sort of roadmap that's going to guide you and provide you with enough money to stop working, right? So the reserve study is going to guide you to provide a path to uh, live in a to have a sustainable and successful financial future. So proactive planning
And
is
for
beneficial.
our final question, we are about at our time. This is kind of a tough question. How do you convince your fellow board members to respect the reserve study?
Yeah, I think it's all about education. It's understanding what the goals we're trying to accomplish here. We have this conversation on a regular basis, trying to sell the reserve study to owners. All you can do is put this information in front of them, understand what the costs of ownership are. The reserve study is going to reveal this. And if owners want to bury their head in the sand and not think about what's happening to their common areas on a regular basis, then things are going to take a turn for the worse. And again, it's not fair to the owners. You have to um, constantly talk about reserve studies, talk about maintaining the property, talk about renegotiating contracts so that everyone has an understanding of how the association operates and how it needs to be maintained moving forward. The board of directors has a responsibility um, to protect, preserve, and enhance the assets of the community. And by not doing so, is not fair to the rest of the ownership and uh, irresponsible.
Excellent. Well, that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, Elon, for presenting. That was a very informative presentation. I know there's always a lot of questions from boards regarding reserve studies, and you answered a lot of those questions today. So thank you. This presentation will be posted on our website, and our next webinar will be on May 9th regarding construction defects. Hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.